Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is your brother Garfield. And of course, today is a special day in the history of the conscious community. We have, excuse me, in my opinion, the greatest New Testament scholar of our time. I don't know if in history, everybody talking about Tom Brady and Super Bowls, the greatest of all time. So I thought I would throw that in. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to somebody who has changed my life when it comes to New Testament studies and has changed a lot of people's lives within my own community, but only when it comes to the Jesus existing question. They don't like Bart Ehrman. They love you for everything else, except when it comes to did Jesus exist. But, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Mr. Dr. Professor Bart Ehrman. How are you doing today, Bart?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
All right. So let's start off. The first question is, tell us a little about your background before you got into New Testament and studying and going to different colleges, Moody and all those things. Tell us a little about you before you entered into the college world.
I grew up in Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas, and I was just kind of a regular high school kid. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, which it was the church my parents went to, and I was active in the church. I was I was like an altar boy. I was like an acolyte in this Episcopal church. And then when I was in high school, I played sports, and I was actually on the debate team, which I really liked a lot and stuff and all that. But when I was about 15, I had a born again experience and became an evangelical Christian, very committed to the Bible and to faith in Christ. And that changed the course of my life, because then I decided to pursue that in college instead of going to a secular college. I was either going to go to Kansas University and probably be on the debate team at Kansas University, or I was going to go to a Christian college. I ended up doing that.
Okay, all right. So from there on, who were the people who influenced you the most while you started college? So obviously you were an evangelical Christian before going into college, but who were the people that influenced you as you were in college, as far as books you would read and so forth?
Yeah. So when I went to college, I decided that I was going to go hardcore and just I wasn't going to go to some milk toast Christian college. So I decided to go to I was basically a fundamentalist. I mean, I believed that the Bible was the inerrant Word of God. There was no mistakes in it of any kind whatsoever, and that and so I went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, which is a fundamentalist Bible college. It was a three-year degree, and I was heavily influenced by all sorts of very conservative evangelical thinkers. We were very conservative in terms of our religious beliefs, and most every way, including, we thought Billy Graham was way too liberal, so we were pretty conservative, and so. The influence on my life would be people that no one would know of today. I mean, because they're very conservative fundamentalist theologians, basically. But a number of my teachers were very influential on me at Moody Bible Institute, and convinced me that I really should think about pursuing academics as a career, because I did well in my classes there. And that started me off thinking, because in high school nobody would have thought I'd become a scholar. It's the last thing anyway with it. But I did well because I was really invested in it, and since I was invested, I put a lot of effort in it. So I decided I wanted to become a Bible scholar at that point.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have about probably like around 55 minutes to an hour with Dr. Ehrman. If you do have a question after the 35-minute mark, you could start posting your questions, and I'll definitely ask them to Dr. Ehrman. But I'm going to go through some questions that a lot of folks sent me, and I also had myself. One of the first questions is, was Paul teaching a different theology than Jesus?
This is a really good question, and it's a complicated question. I actually have, when I teach an undergraduate class at Chapel Hill. So I teach at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I've taught here since 1988. And every year I teach an introduction to the New Testament class, a large class. Usually historically, it's been about 300 students in this class. And what I normally do is I have them have class debates. And one of the debates I traditionally have them do is they have to debate. So some students debate affirmative, some negative on the topic. Resolve: Paul and Jesus represented fundamentally different religions. And so did they have different religions?
Wow.
And some students are required to say yes and to argue yes, and others are required to say no and argue no. And so it's a very complicated issue. My view is, I mean, they have a lot of things in common, Jesus and Paul. They both are Jews of the first century. They both are committed Jews. They both believe that God is the creator. There's only one God to be worshipped, and that he gave Israel the law of God, and that the law had to be followed. So they agree on all that as Jews. But Paul was living after people started thinking Jesus was raised from the dead. And my view is that Jesus, the historical Jesus, was not preaching about his death and resurrection from the dead, that the historical Jesus was instead telling people what to do in light of the coming kingdom of God, by which he meant an actual kingdom here on earth. There's going to be a kind of a paradise return to earth, and people need to be ready for it, because if they're not ready for it, they're going to be destroyed. And so Jesus is trying to get people to repent by following the true teachings of the law. Paul, as a Jew, growing up as a Jew, agreed that one had to keep the law. But when he converted to be a follower of Jesus, he came to believe that anybody who believed in Jesus' death and resurrection could be right with God and receive salvation. And it didn't matter if you're a Jew or not. And so Paul taught that Gentiles did not have to keep the law in order to be right with God. So Jesus thought the way to be right with God is by keeping the law as well as you can, and repent and return to God. Paul thought the way to be right with God is by believing in Jesus' death and resurrection. And for me, that's not the same thing. I think those are different things. And so some people see serious continuity between those two views. Other people see radical discontinuity, and that could be debated, but I don't think it could be debated that those are very different points of view.
All right. This is a follow-up to that. You know, eventually, if you do admire the interview, I would bring you back. And one of the reasons I would bring you back, because this would take up the whole interview, this question here. A decade by decade breakdown of the development of the New Testament. Let's say, for example, we go back to 29 CE, the Common Era, and we have Jesus teaching to the disciples. We don't have Paul around yet. Would you say before Passover, Jesus is teaching? We don't have Paul yet with his vision and so forth. So his particular teachings or letters are not included in what would eventually become the New Testament, because those folks weren't physically writing down letters, but they had the teachings from Jesus saying, hey, thou don't this, don't do that, and so forth. At that point of your decade by decade breakdown, would you say that the Christians today don't follow what Jesus taught originally to his early disciples?
I would say absolutely they don't. Because Jesus taught his disciples that if they really wanted to enter into the kingdom, they have to keep the law that God had given to Moses. And following Jesus did not mean believing in his death and resurrection. Well, in Jesus' ministry in, say, the year 29, it meant because he hadn't died and he hadn't been raised, and that isn't what he taught anyway. I mean, he taught that you have to keep the Jewish law. And so there are people today, there are Christians today who consider themselves Jewish Christians, Messianic Christians, or one group that's the best known group is Jews for Jesus, most of whom are not Jews, by the way. They're Gentiles who try to take on the Jewish law, and that's fine. But even that isn't what Jesus was all about. So I can go decade by decade if you want, but you're right. I mean, in the 20s, nothing like what Paul was thinking was even imagined. In the 30s, I think Paul probably converted 3 or 4 years after Jesus' death. Jesus died maybe 29, maybe 30, somewhere in there sometime. Paul probably converted 3 or 4 years later. He didn't invent Christianity. I mean, he didn't invent the idea that Jesus' death and resurrection could bring salvation, because he was persecuting Christians who said that before he converted. And so people were saying that before, but Paul certainly developed it. But we don't get any of the New Testament at all, any of the writings we have in the New Testament, until Paul starts writing his letters, and we don't get that till the 50s, or maybe 49, but 50, and so that changes everything too.
All right, let's go in a different direction, because I'm going to be touching on Paul, prophecies, false doctrines, Egyptomaniac stuff. So just bear with me, because I have to scramble them together. All right. Were the people who followed Jesus as Jews, are they the same sect of Jews who, during the Kittus War, considered Lucas Andreas or Lucas being a Messiah, or the same sect of Jews who thought Simon Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, or were these different sects, or 3 different sects of Jews?
So early Judaism is very complicated, and the way I usually look at Judaism is that it's how do I put this? In comparison with modern Christianity, most Christians belong to some kind of denomination or other. I mean, they go to some kind of church, or they might be Episcopalian, they might be Roman Catholic, they might be Greek Orthodox, they might be Baptist, they might be Methodist. Like most everybody's something, and if they're not something, they say I'm independent. But most people were one of those. And Judaism wasn't like that. We tend to think it was, because we hear about the scribe, we hear about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, and so we think about them like everybody's in one of these groups, the way the Christians are all in the denomination, and it actually wasn't like that. In the time of Jesus, there were probably about 6 million Jews in the world, is the usual estimate. It might be 5, it might be 7, I don't know, but it's like around there, 6 million Jews. The largest of the sects that we know about were the Pharisees. We know about them not just from the New Testament, but also from Josephus. Josephus tells us there were 6,000 of them, and that was the largest. So 6,000 out of 6 million, that's not very much.
Wow.
And so I don't think that Judaism is like like there's this sect, that sect. What you have are most Jews who are just Jews. They just they believe whatever they believe, and I would say, though, that the followers of Jesus would be characterized probably by modern scholars typically as apocalyptic Jews. In other words, it's not that they were in a sect that was called the Apocalypticists, but they had these views that were fairly common in Jesus' day among Jews, that said that this world is controlled by forces of evil, that God has relinquished control of this world now for some reason, that these forces of evil are in charge, and that's why there's so much pain, misery, and suffering in the world. I mean, why is this such a rotten place? Because these forces of evil are in charge, but God's getting fed up, and very soon he's going to intervene and destroy these forces of evil and set up a new kingdom here on earth. And Jesus was telling people, get ready, because it's going to come. And if you're not ready, if you haven't repented and you're not behaving well, you're going to be destroyed. And so I think Jesus' followers probably agreed with that. I think that some of the later revolutionary movements did not see it that way. The revolts that happened in the late 60s and then in the 130s that you're mentioning were really Jews who thought that there's a military political solution to the problem of Israel. Not that God is going to intervene, probably, but that in fact we need to take up the sword and drive out these Romans. And so there was it was a very different view from the one that Jesus and his followers had.
Okay. Let me do a follow-up to that question. Who do you think fits the Jesus of the Bible, historically speaking? Who is there a character in history that you'd be like, it possibly could be this guy?
You mean apart from Jesus himself? Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure what you're asking. There are a lot of people like Jesus who were apocalyptic prophets who said that they were, who believed that God's kingdom was coming soon and people needed to repent or they're going to be destroyed. John the Baptist thought that. The members of the Essene community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, they thought that. Many Pharisees thought that basically. But I don't think there's another person who could be Jesus. I mean, it's kind of like saying, who do you think Trump really was? Was he, was he so and so? No, he was Trump.
You know what? You're right. I worded that question incorrectly.
Okay.
What I should have said is, if outside of the New Testament, is there someone who is written about would fit, who would be aligned with the biblical Jesus?
There are people that Josephus mentions. Josephus is this first century Jewish historian who he's the one who gives us most of our information about what it was like in Israel in the first century, because he was from the first century. He's very prominent figure in the first, and he wrote these massive volumes about first century Judaism. So he describes some people that have similar views, who were outspoken prophets, who roused opposition to the Romans and who were killed as a result for saying that there was going to be a divine intervention. Some of these he names, and there'll be differences from them in Jesus, but there's a guy named Theudas, for example. There's another guy that he calls the Egyptian. There's another guy actually who's named Jesus. So this fellow lived about 40 years after Jesus of Nazareth in the late 60s, when there was this uprising against the Romans. His name was Jesus, son of Ananias. And he was in Jerusalem telling people that they needed to repent because God's judgment was coming soon. And the leaders got fed up with him because the city was under siege. And this guy was a real troublemaker. And so they finally arrested him and flogged him within an inch of his life. But he kept doing it. He wouldn't shut up. And eventually the Romans were throwing missiles into the city. They're like catapulting rocks and things. And the guy got hit by a rock and it killed him. but he was like, the name Jesus was a common name. It was like, it used to be when I was a kid, like every shortstop in the major leagues was named Jesus, or second baseman. Yeah.
All right, let's move to prophecy for a second. In Zechariah 9:10, it talks about, and he shall speak peace unto the heathen, and his dominion shall be from sea even to sea, and from the river even to the ends of the earth. Did Jesus ever fulfill that prophecy as being a king over a kingdom with an army, dominion from sea to sea to the ends of the earth?
No, he got crucified. he didn't take over other kingdoms. The kingdom of Rome destroyed him rather decisively. Yeah.
All right.
But the Christian thinking, of course, is that's in traditional Christian thinking, that's his first coming. But he's coming back to finish the job. But if you ask, did Jesus do that? No, he didn't do that. He didn't do anything the Messiah was supposed to do.
All right. I got a complicated question, right, regarding Sunday worship, right? I think I emailed you this, but let me ask you this. Ask Dr. Ehrman if he has a translation of the Didache.
It's called the Didache.
Didache, right? My bad. His understanding of the opening of the 14th chapter of the Didache. Would he say the text is referring to Sunday worship? Would he say Sunday worship is at least as old as the Didache? And if so, to when would he date the Didache? Early 2nd century, later, or earlier?
The Didache. It's called the Didache. So the word Didache, it's a Greek word, and so it doesn't sound like it should. It's called the Didache. And Didache in Greek means teaching. And it's called that, this book is called that because the title of the book is The Teaching of the 12 Apostles. And so that's the full title of the book, Teaching of the 12 Apostles. And so the question is about, this passage in 14, about the Lord's Day when people gather together and break bread. This is referring to what happens on Sunday. This is referring to the worship service in the Didachists community. It is not the first reference to Christians worshiping on Sunday, though. Already in the book of 1 Corinthians, well, in 1 and 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about Christians coming together on the first day of the week for worship, and so it's already in Paul. The idea that the Sunday would be called the Lord's Day first shows up in the book of Revelation. And so the Didache is part of that stream of tradition. Dating the Didache is a very complicated thing. Let me put it in some perspective before I explain about the Didache. Usually, as we were saying, Jesus is usually thought to have died around the year 30 of the Common Era, 29, 33, somewhere in there, around the year 30. The first writings are Paul's in the 50s, and probably up to the early 60s, 62 or so, 63 when he stopped, the letters we've got. The Gospels, Mark is probably the first Gospel written around the year 70. John is written around 90 or 95, probably. The Didache, the last book of the New Testament probably is the book of 2 Peter. 2 Peter is almost certainly not written by Peter himself. It's usually dated around the year 120 or so. The Didache was discovered in the 19th century. And so it's referred to by early church fathers, but we didn't have it until it was discovered in the 19th century. And when it was discovered, they realized this is an old book. And the question is, how old is it? How old is it? Today, what most people think is that the Didache is actually assembled from different sources. There are several parts of it that come from one. There's one passage that comes from one source, another from another source, another. It's not like a consistent whole. It's like four things put together. Those sources would have been written at different times, but it is commonly thought that the final production, the thing we have now, probably dates around the year 100 or so. 100, 110, which means it would be earlier than at least one book and maybe more of the New Testament. But of course, it didn't make it in.
Okay. All right. I'm going to piggyback on that, the dating of books in a second. Let's move to something else right now, because I was going to ask you, when did Sunday worship start with the church? But you already answered that with your question. All right. What are the top 5 reasons for you that you would say Jesus existed?
Okay. Well, so as you know, I wrote a book about this. And so the thing is, look, in case the viewing audience doesn't know, I am not a Christian anymore. And so I do not have a stake in whether Jesus existed or not, because my life would be the same. I'm not a believer in Jesus. I'm not a believer in God. I'm an atheist. And so it's not, it's not for religious reasons. I'm also a historian. I want to know what happened in the past.
Yep.
And I think, we've never been in a time, this country, this world has never been in a time when it really matters what happened in the past, because people want to cover up what happened in the past. And when you cover up what happened in the past, it only leads to trouble, serious trouble. Cultural trouble, social. I mean, when you cover up the way people have behaved. So, I live in the American South. This is not a, there are some nasty things in our history in the South. I mean, there's some good things. I love this. I love where I live. But I mean, there's some very, very nasty things here, and we should not sweep them under the carpet. We need to know the facts about history. Jesus today is worshipped by 2 billion people, over 2 billion people. And so knowing about him historically, it really matters, because we're talking about 2 billion people who it would matter for. So if he didn't exist, that would matter. But I don't believe he existed for any religious reasons, because I don't even believe in God. And so, but that said, Jesus certainly existed. I mean, it's like saying, yes, Jesus did exist. Why do I think? Well, so I wrote a whole book trying to explain it, but and some of the reasons are complicated, too complicated for this. But I mean, the book, by the way, is just called "Did Jesus Exist?" And the answer, I don't give the answer in the title. The title is yes. Okay, let me give you a couple of reasons. The Apostle Paul is our first author. Paul personally knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter, and his own brother James. This is Jesus' brother James. It's not like his spiritual brother. It's not like a friend of his. It's not like something else. Paul knew his brother. It talks about him. If he didn't exist, you'd think his brother would know. So that's one reason. So we have better documentation for Jesus than 99.999% of the world that lived at the time. We have 4 gospels. These gospels are problematic historically. I've spent a career showing that these are problematic historically, but there's still historical information in them. You can have problematic sources. I mean, you can listen to Fox News and get a few facts. The facts that you don't necessarily have to say that everything's a lie. And and people who are people who are really conservative would say the same thing about MSNBC. At least they should. Look, it's not all lies. They'd say there's some facts in there. So the New Testament absolutely has some facts in it. And these gospels are not simply people sitting down 40 years later and making stuff up. There is really good evidence that all of these gospels are based on earlier sources. As I was saying, the Didache is, but for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they definitely have. Mark was used by Matthew and Luke, but Matthew and Luke also had another source that scholars call Q. Matthew had a bunch of other sources that we call M. Luke had a bunch of sources. He tells us he had a bunch of sources that we call L. John had a bunch of sources. How many sources are there behind these gospels? I don't know. A dozen? They're all earlier than the gospels, and they all attest to Jesus, and these sources are not dependent on each other. It's not as if you get 12 people in a room and give them their walking orders and tell them what to say, and they all say these are independent witnesses. Yeah. Anyway, Josephus mentions Jesus. I mean, you got not. It's like, yeah. So,
Dr. Ehrman, I think my community would like for you to produce a video testifying, hey, I'm Jesus, guys, and I lived back 2,000 years ago. I think that may qualify as evidence of Jesus, because I don't get it. I really, really don't get it. And it's let's move on to this, because
can I just say one thing about it, though? Sure. That I understand why people who either used to be Christian and are not anymore, or people who are very strong atheists and think that Christians are bad news. I mean, I can understand why someone like that would be opposed to Christianity. I am personally not opposed to Christianity, even though I'm not a Christian. I think there are a lot of bad things in Christianity. I think there are good things in Christianity too. I'm not opposed to it any more than I'm opposed to Islam or to Judaism or Hinduism or anything else. I mean, I'm a live and let live kind of guy, but I think, you do need to identify the bad things. But I can understand not liking Christianity and wanting to attack it. But if you want to convince somebody that Christianity has problems, you should not say things that Christians are just going to laugh at as being ridiculous. And I would just tell you, most Christians and most scholars of the New Testament just laugh when somebody says Jesus didn't exist. They just don't take it seriously. If you want your criticisms of Christianity to be taken seriously, don't shoot yourself in the foot. Mm-hmm. Which is, I think, what is going on with this. It's not helpful. Jesus could have existed, and Christianity could be a big mistake, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. So anyway, that's just my point.
All right. Let's move along. How is it, and this is just a sidebar question, how is it mythicists will say Paul is historical, but Jesus with way more evidence is not?
I don't know. We've got because Paul isn't threatening them, because if Jesus didn't exist, then Christianity has no basis. If Paul didn't exist, Christianity would still have a basis. And so it's not because of logic or because of evidence. It's because it's more convenient to say Jesus didn't exist. That's the only reason I can think of. We have 13 letters in the New Testament that claim to be written by Paul. And we know that scholars have long thought that 6 of these were actually not written by Paul. And we have a lot of letters from outside the New Testament that claim to be written by Paul that were not written by Paul. Not a lot. We have some. We have 3rd Corinthians, for example. Paul did not write that. Well, so if we've got 6 and more, why not just say all 13 were not written by Paul and somebody else made up Paul? I mean, why not? I mean, so you can say this. You can say that about anybody, and if somebody wants to believe it, they're going to believe it. It doesn't matter if there's evidence or not; they're just going to believe it.
All right. Many in my community hold to Jesus being a copy of Osiris and Horus, different stories, rising from the dead, different things. What have you found any direct or indirect evidence of Egypt on Christianity?
Yeah, no, not really. I've looked for it. The parallels to Horus and Osiris are if you actually read ancient sources, they're really not very closely related. What people do, of course, is they read other people who say that Jesus is just like a Horus or Osiris, and some mythicists say things like, that he's just like Mithras, who was not Egyptian but Persian. But Mithras, they say Mithras was born on December 25th. His mother was a virgin. He was crucified. He was raised from the dead 3 days later. He had 12 disciples. They say stuff like this. It's just wrong. It's wrong. But if you say it enough, people will believe you. With Osiris, yeah, no, the similarities are not particularly significant. I do think that Greek and Roman deities, the understanding of Greek and Roman deities, especially Greek and Roman humans who became gods, I think those people had a pretty big effect on how Christians portrayed Jesus. We have people from about Jesus' time, who were and much earlier, who were thought to be spectacular human beings that the gods took up to heaven, and then they became divine beings. And I think and they did, during their lives, they did miracles, and they were spectacularly born, and they ascended to heaven. They have these things about them, and Jesus' stories are often modeled on those. But by and large, Egypt was such a funny bird in the early ancient world. I don't mean that in a negative way at all. It was a unique culture, a very special culture that was seen as unusual by ancient people. And so when I just wrote a book called Heaven and Hell, which was about understandings of the afterlife and where the Christian understandings of heaven and hell came from, since they're not in the Old Testament, they're not what Jesus taught. Right. And my plan had been to show how Egyptian religion affected Christian views of heaven and hell. But the more research I did, the more I realized they had no effect on Christian views of heaven and hell. It's just they're different. They're just different. They're amazing. They're fantastic. They're great, but they are not like the Christian views or the Jewish views. And so it wasn't a major influence. Greek and Roman religions were, but not Egyptian religions. Okay. In my opinion.
Yeah, because when you look at the story in Matthew of the guys getting out of the graves and running around, there's a Roman element I see in that a lot. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I think so. It's a complicated business. What a lot of mythicists say is that Jesus being raised from the dead was said of a lot of people in the ancient world, and that these gods rise from the dead, and that it's like Jesus, and it's actually not like Jesus in any of the cultures, because Jesus was a human being who died and then was physically brought back from the dead. This is in the Christian tradition, in what Christians say. This is the Christian view, is that his body actually came back to life and was made immortal. So he was a human who was made into a divine being, and that he went up to heaven and was glorified at that point. And so, like Osiris wasn't a human who became a divine being. Osiris was a god, and he didn't come back, as made immortal after being mortal. I mean, it's like the whole thing is different. So the view is actually closest to what we find in Jewish apocalyptic thinking. I was earlier talking about Jewish apocalypticism. It was Jewish apocalypticists who believed that the body would come back to life at the end, and that a person would live forever in their body. And Matthew is playing on that theme. That these bodies come out of the tombs when Jesus gets crucified. It's a Jewish apocalyptic view that bodies will come back to life. And so that's what happens in Matthew.
All right. moving on. I don't know if this falls in your realm or expertise, but have you found any trace of Christianity in West Africa before the Portuguese came to West Africa in the 1500s?
I'm not an expert on that. I think the answer is almost certainly no. But I really don't know. I could be wrong about that. But I mean, usually most of the African nations, as I understand it, were introduced to Christianity because of a colonialist expansion, and which led to missionary activity.
All right. Second Esdras, one of the Apocrypha books, is used in my community a lot. Some even claiming Jesus quoted from it. Can you break down why Second Esdras wasn't written by Ezra and is considered a late first century book?
Second Esdras is sometimes called Fourth Ezra. It is an apocalyptic Jewish book. So I've been talking about Jewish apocalypticism some, and it's a very fine representation of what we know about Jewish apocalypses from the time. It's dated to the first century because it seems to presuppose the events in Judaism that happened in the first century, and especially the destruction of the temple by the Romans. It is set up as if it's written by Ezra, who was dealing with the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians 600 years earlier. But these apocalyptic texts in Judaism, we have a lot of apocalypses in Judaism. The first one we have is the book of First Enoch. Sometimes it's called Enoch, but First Enoch. And then the book of Daniel in the Old Testament is the next one. These are written in the 2nd or 3rd century BCE. Daniel's written about in the 160s BCE. But then you start getting books like Second Baruch and Fourth Ezra and the Apocalypse of Abraham. You get these books. And one of the distinctive features of these books is that they virtually all claim to be written by a famous Jewish person living centuries earlier. Mm-hmm. This provides authority for the books. And it also, because, it's written by a famous spiritual person he's famous. And so he wrote this. But it's also important because many of these books predict what's going to happen in the future. And it's much easier to predict what's going to happen in the future if you pretend to be somebody living 300 years ago, and then you can predict he predicts what's going to happen in the future. But when you're writing it, that future is past, so that happened. And so you write it as if it's a prediction, and then that. And so you get some of that with all of these apocalyptic books. And so they're written in the name of someone. And so it's quite clear that Fourth Ezra was not written by Ezra. It's not right after the exile. It's in the first century, probably in the first century sometime.
Would you say that Christianity as a book religion, it supersedes what the earliest followers followed in today's light? Because I could come to you now and say, hey, if you are a Christian, and say, hey, you know what? Book of Revelation applies to today. The 10 kings or whatever in the hills or 7 kings is applied to the European Union, and the 3rd Israel temple is going to be built, and refer today instead of what the earliest followers were following, who didn't have any books, who were just following a man who they felt was the Messiah. Yeah.
My next book is on the book of Revelation, how it's being misinterpreted by people who think it's going to happen soon. So I'm really interested in that topic. But the general question you're asking is really important. And I think what happens in Christianity is that it develops into very different things over time. And I think most people realize this because if you ask a Baptist, for example, or a Pentecostal, or you ask, somebody in an independent Bible church, if their form of Christianity is like what was going on in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, in the Roman Catholic Church in the 13th century, they'll say, no, it's not at all. It's very different. If they don't know it's different, then they don't know anything about the Middle Ages, because it's not the same. Well, the 13th century was very different from the 5th century. And the 5th century was very different from the 2nd century. And the 2nd century is very different from the 1st century. And so Christianity has always developed. There are some forms of Christianity that say the development is divinely inspired. We are moving the way God wants us to move. And so that's the basic line of the Roman Catholic Church. It says, look, it doesn't all end with the Bible. It continues. God continually develops as the church develops. He develops us. And that's the Roman Catholic view that Protestants reject. Mm-hmm. Protestants, so whether you're Baptist or Pentecostal or Methodist, Episcopal, whatever kind of Protestant you are, Protestants have always insisted that you skip over the entirety of history to get back to the Bible in some sense. Not so much Episcopalians, but most everyone else. And so the idea is that especially Bible churches, conservative evangelical churches, they ignore 2,000 years of history, 1,800 years of history, and they think you just get back to the Bible. But if you get back to the Bible, your religion will not be what your religion is. In Jesus' followers in the year 50, say, when Paul started writing his letters, they didn't have church buildings, they didn't have pews, they didn't have hymnals, they didn't sing hymns, they didn't take communion with a little wafer of whatever and some grape juice. And this was nothing. It was nothing like that. They met and it was nothing like that. And so people think they're getting back to the Bible. They are not getting back to the Bible.
Some early Jewish Christians called Paul an apostate. Whatever happened to those groups? Did they merge in with Orthodoxy and did they get trampled? What happened to those groups?
So we know of a number of Christian groups that continue to maintain a Jewish identity for centuries. Of course, the earliest Jews, Jesus' own followers, when they came to believe that he was the Messiah, they themselves were Jewish Christians. They continued being Jewish. They didn't stop being Jewish. They were still Jews, but they believed the Messiah had come. The Messiah. So there were people then after that who continued to identify as Jews, and there were different groups of these people, and it's hard to differentiate among these groups. It's hard to have a clear idea of which groups there were and what they called themselves. So there's some groups that appear to call themselves Ebionites, a group that appear to call themselves Nazarenes, a group that sometimes they're just called Hebrew Christian. They're like these different groups. In different places. Even though it was the original form of Christianity, it came to be stamped out. It wasn't necessarily that they were persecuted by other Christians or like martyred or anything like that. It's just that most people who converted to Christianity were Gentiles. They were either raised pagan themselves, or they had early on, or they were just from Gentile stock. They weren't Jewish. And so they didn't keep the Jewish law. They didn't see any reason they should have to keep the Jewish law. So they didn't keep the Jewish law. And eventually, there just weren't that many Jews converting. Most Jews didn't think Jesus could be the Messiah. As we were saying earlier, the Messiah was supposed to set up a great kingdom in Jerusalem and rule Israel. And Jesus was not that. He was a crucified criminal. So, he's not the Messiah for most Jews. Definitely. So eventually over time, these Jewish groups just kind of petered out. We know about them up through the 4th or 5th Christian centuries. They still exist. But by the time you get to the Middle Ages, if they're there at all, they're very much on the margins until kind of modern times, when you start getting these messianic movements with people claiming that, Christianity is true and they're going to be Jewish as well. It's kind of a modern thing.
All right. We have around 15 minutes. If you have any questions, post the questions now, because I have like around 6 more I'm going to ask Dr. Ehrman, and then you guys could get your questions in. Dr. Ehrman, was Jesus a false prophet based on these verses? Matthew 16 verses 28, 23 verses 36, 24 verses 34, and so on. Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. All these things shall come upon this generation. This generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled.
I never use the designation false prophet because that has kind of a religious tone to me. It seems to me a false prophet, that would mean that there are true prophets, and that would mean you've got a belief in some kind of prophecy, and I don't. I'm not a Christian. So what I would say is that I think Jesus certainly predicted that the end of the age was going to come within his disciples' lifetime, within his generation. And I would also say it did not come. If it came, we wouldn't have such a wretched world now. The verses you're flashing up now are the same verses from Mark, and it's the same thing. I think Jesus really said these things. I think he really meant them. I think his disciples believed them, and but I don't think they happened. Christians, of course, people who are Christians would say, well, he didn't really mean this literally. He meant it in this way or that way. But I think that Jesus wasn't speaking metaphorically here. I think he really meant this stuff.
All right. We're going into Matthew and Luke in Chronicles, the genealogy of Jesus. And I noticed that Zerubbabel's children, and in Matthew and Luke, we have two figures that's been troubling to Christianity for a while: Abuid and Risa. From Matthew, you see that the name Abuid after Zerubbabel, and you see in Luke Risa. Can you explain who Abuid and Risa is, based on the fact we already had the sons of Zerubbabel in 1 Chronicles 3:19 and 20, and Risa and Abuid is not mentioned?
The problem, there are lots of problems with the genealogies of both Matthew and Luke. Matthew's, how do we put it? They both trace the line of Jesus from Abraham to David. I'm sorry. They trace the line of from Abraham to David down to Jesus. Luke's genealogy actually goes all the way back to Adam, and so it's a much longer genealogy. But the most striking things about the genealogies of Matthew and Luke are that they're different genealogies from the time of David down to Jesus. And so they're different genealogies. Second thing that's odd is that Matthew in particular has a kind of a structure of his genealogy where he wants to argue that there are 14 generations between Abraham and David, 14 generations between David and the Babylonian exile, and 14 generations between the Babylonian exile and Jesus, which would show that something really significant is in God's plan every 14th generation. So therefore, Jesus is the Messiah. The problem is, to get there, Matthew had to take away names from from part of the genealogy. So he's not giving you the same genealogy as First Chronicles. And so there are places where he drops out names. Why would he substitute names? I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure anybody does.
All right. What do you think about Coptic Christianity?
We don't know when Coptic Christianity started. The later legend is that Christianity was taken to Egypt by Mark, the guy who wrote the Gospel of Mark. That's a legendary account. We don't know really anything about the early history of Christianity in Egypt. Alexandria itself was a Greek city. It's named after Alexander the Great. He founded the city, and so it had more of a Greek influence. But outside of Alexandria, you start getting Christianity in further south in Egypt. The further south you go, it actually becomes Upper Egypt. It's kind of confusing because Upper Egypt is in the south and Lower Egypt is in the north, which seems backwards to us, but that's how it is. So you get Coptic Christianity in other regions of Egypt, but we don't have good records about how it came to be. Coptic is, we start getting Coptic texts, I don't know, 3rd or 4th century or so. We start getting Coptic Bible translations maybe in the 2nd century is when they started translating the New Testament into Coptic. Coptic was a language, by the way, that it's actually an Egyptian language, but it uses the Greek alphabet. And so if you see a piece of Coptic writing, it'll look like it's Greek, because what happened is missionaries came into Egypt in order to translate the Bible into the Egyptian language, but the Egyptian language had not been written down in terms of an alphabet. They had so they invented an alphabetic language, and they used the Greek alphabet because these were Greek-speaking Christians. And so Coptic looks like Greek in many ways. But we don't really know a lot about Coptic Christianity until we start getting into the 4th and 5th centuries. And so anything before that is sophisticated guesswork.
Can you show the Jews with a God concept before they came in contact with Egypt?
We actually don't know much about the Jewish contact with Egypt. In the Old Testament, of course, what happens is Egypt exists before Abraham, the father of the Jews, and Abraham, and it's a kingdom. And Abraham goes down there, and then his son Isaac goes down there. They're trying to escape famines, and they eventually, the people of Israel move there because of a famine. They get enslaved there, and they're there for 400 years. And then God raises up Moses and takes them out at the Exodus. They cross the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea, and gives them their law. And so some people say, look, they're getting all this stuff from Egypt. And my view is that that whole narrative is probably legendary. I don't think there was an Abraham or an Isaac. I think these are just later stories. I don't know if there's Moses, but I kind of doubt it. I think that Israel emerged among the people who were living in what was then called Canaan. And it was just a group of people that started banding together and started worshiping a particular God, and that eventually came to be known as Yahweh. And they started attributing Yahweh characteristics of other Canaanite deities, such as El. And so that's why in the Old Testament, God is called El or Elohim, and he's called Yahweh, and he's called other things. And so there is not a lot of influence on the Jewish religion or culture from Egypt, so far as I can tell.
All right. Is there any evidence of a Aramaic Peshita before the Greek?
So the Aramaic Peshita is a translation of the Bible that is probably made about 500 years after the original Greek text was made. It's an interesting. The Peshita is interesting because it's in Syriac. Syriac, of course, is the language of Syria, but ancient Syriac is a kind of a dialect of Aramaic, and Aramaic was the language Jesus spoke. And so some people thought that if you can see a Syriac version of the New Testament, the Gospels, for example, then you can get a better idea of what Jesus actually said. Mm-hmm. A couple things to say about that. The Peshita is not the earliest version we have of the Syriac Gospels. There are earlier versions that are just called the Old Syriac that are earlier than the Peshita. Second of all, the Peshita, the Syriac translation of Peshita, is made from Greek manuscripts, and so it isn't going back to the original Aramaic or anything like that. It was a translation made in Syria for people who wanted the New Testament, which had been written in Greek. So I don't think you don't have an evidence of Peshita before Greek manuscripts. No.
All right. This is more theological questions. We have a few minutes left. Does Dr. Ehrman think the rule of faith creed of the early fathers is derived from oral traditions about Jesus and the church, or more literary sources, i.e., Gospels or the Q?
What this person is calling the rule of faith is a statement. It's kind of like a creed, where somebody says, "This is what we believe. We believe this, 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 and this." There's one God. Jesus is His Son. Jesus died for the sins of the world. It sounds a lot like a modern creed. We first start getting these rules of faith stated by opponents of heretics at the end of the 2nd century. Especially big on the rule of faith are Irenaeus in 185, Tertullian around the year 200. They are not basing these on oral traditions about Jesus. They're basing these on what they understood to be the written texts that they considered to be the inspired Christian scriptures. There was not a finished New Testament yet. All the books had been written, but Christian groups had not agreed on which books should be conceived of as the Christian scriptures. But Irenaeus and Tertullian agreed that the 4 Gospels that we have today would be scripture. Paul's writings would be scripture. And the rule of faith is based on their interpretation of these writings and on how these writings had been interpreted by their predecessors.
Okay. Should we think of the Nazarenes and the Ebionites as one and the same community of the early ascension of Isaiah? And when should we date the ascension of Isaiah?
The Ascension of Isaiah is a very interesting text that is, like these other texts I've been talking about, is made up of two very different sources that have been kind of scissored and pasted together. There are some debates about the dating of the text. I think almost certainly it comes from the middle of the 2nd century, because it seems to presuppose a Gnostic understanding of the world in some ways. The beloved, Christ is called the beloved in this text, and the beloved has to descend through the evil powers of the heavens. So the heavens, there are a number of heavens, and each one has an evil power, and he's got to have the right passwords to get down through. And he comes down to heaven, earth, and then he goes back up again. And that sounds like a descent narrative, like you get in Gnostic text. So I date it to the 2nd century. We don't really know who was using this text, but we have it, and it's very interesting to read. But yeah.
All right. Last one from Courtney. Does Dr. Ehrman agree with Michael Holmes in his assessment that the earliest data of the New Testament manuscripts suggest a microfluidity in textual variation and a macro stability?
Okay. Mike Holmes is a good friend of mine. We were doctoral. He was my first teacher of New Testament when I was a first-year seminary student. He was like a graduate student who taught. We did my recitation, but we became friends, and we both did PhDs under Bruce Metzger, and we've co-authored 2 books together. So he's a good friend of mine. He's an evangelical Christian. He's connected with the Museum of the Bible. Whatever people might think of that. So we disagree on everything theologically, but we're good friends, very, very close friends. I'm not sure what he means by that. So that could mean 3 or 4 things. He definitely means some. If I had more context, I would know what he means by it. But what I would mean by it is that most of the changes in the text, most of the changes that scribes made when they're copying their manuscripts of the New Testament, we have 5,800 some manuscripts of the New Testament. We've got a lot of manuscripts, and they have a lot of differences among them. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of thousands of differences. Most of those differences are micro. They're like, scribes couldn't spell. They didn't, like, doesn't change the meaning. It just, you can't spell. I mean, most of these hundreds of thousands of differences make no difference for anything. You can't even put them in English translation. You wouldn't know the difference. But so there's a lot of those micro things. There are some macro things, some pretty significant things, like the story of the woman taken in adultery. Let the one without sin be the first to cast a stone at her. That entire story, that wasn't there. That was added. Or the last 12 verses of Mark, where Jesus, after his resurrection, shows up and tells his disciples that his followers will be able to drink poison and it won't hurt them, and they'll be able to handle deadly snakes. Yeah, it's the only place in the New Testament said, yeah, that wasn't in there. And so there are these macro things too. And Mike and I both agree on all that. So if that's what he means, yeah, I completely agree with it.
He said you got it. All right. Okay. 2 more questions and we out of here. Was there 4 gospels I don't need to ask it. You already answered that already.
I will say yes, there were. I see the question. I think the gospels were in existence in the 1st century, toward the end of the 1st century, especially.
Islam more similar to early Christianity than modern Christianity?
Is Islam more similar to Christianity than modern Christianity is to early Christianity?
Right.
No, I don't think so. I think the heart of both modern Christianity and earliest Christianity, at the very heart of it, was the belief that the only thing that matters for salvation is the death and resurrection of Jesus, and that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God. And I would say that is one thing that Christianity, ancient and modern, has in common. And it's the core of both of them. And I think Islam has a different core. The Islam, of course, the Quran, of course, does talk about Jesus, and it affirms the importance of Jesus. But I think it's a different conception at the core.
One last. Let me see if there's more. All right, this question here. Do you think through Aramaic Gospel of Matthew, the Nazarene Ebionites held, not containing the first 2 chapters, was more accurate? I think this is like a ball.
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. And the reality is we don't know if there ever existed a version of Matthew without the first two chapters. We don't have a Hebrew Aramaic Gospel of Matthew without the first two chapters. People have speculated that, in fact, there might have been a version without the first two chapters. And it would make sense that the Nazarenes, Ebionites may have had a version of Matthew without the first two chapters. We do have a Gospel of the Nazarenes, but we only have fragments of it, so we don't know everything that it contained. But we do. It would have made sense that their version would have lacked it because allegedly the Nazarenes and the Ebionites did not think Jesus was born of a virgin. And the virgin birth was, kind of central to Matthew 1. They didn't have it, so it would have been sense they got rid of it. And reply to the question that's on my screen from Courtney Thompson, which I'll do very quickly: was there widespread agreement of the text of the New Testament there by the end of the time when I see it? No. it continued to vary, and they're different.
Well, I got one last question.
Okay. All right.
You talked about you have a book called The Triumph of Christianity. Do you think the teaching of Jesus physically resurrecting and that the chance of you believing in him, the same would happen to you? Do you think that is the underlining thing that made Christianity attractive so that it spread throughout the whole Gentile community and the Rome eventually adapted it? Do you think that's the deciding factor? Because every religion had something special in Rome.
Yeah, well, it takes my entire book to explain what really happened. So it's kind of hard to do in 20 seconds. But the basic story is, I think most people hearing that story, that a man was raised from the dead, would think that you're flipping crazy to think so. I don't think they're going to say, oh, then I'm going to believe in him. They're going to say, yeah, no, you're nuts. What did make Christianity succeed is related, though. I think it's a related issue, which is Christians convinced other people slowly, one at a time, that their God was more powerful than the other gods. And the resurrection of Jesus was part of that argument, that God is so powerful he can overcome death. If you convince a pagan that the Christian God is more powerful than all of their gods put together, then the pagan might start worshiping your God. And what happens then, the person becomes a Christian. And in the ancient world, this is unlike Islam and Christianity. In the ancient world, most religions, it didn't matter if you joined a new religion, you still kept your old religion. You didn't give it. They didn't say, if you're our religion, you can't be that religion. Everybody was a bunch of religions. But Christianity said, no, you're my religion. You're not anything else. You've got to give it all up. Christianity is the only one converting people like that. And so whenever they converted somebody, the other religions lost out. And over about 300 years, that made a big difference. So,
I got the final question on the board.
Okay, final one.
I know you're going overtime right now.
Yeah.
How does Dr. Ehrman view Peter's agreement with Paul in Acts 15 council as to grace for salvation versus circumcision of Moses? Wouldn't Peter and witness know Jesus' view of salvation agreed with Paul? Also agreed with Paul.
Yes, it would indicate it, and the author of Acts certainly thinks that Peter had this view, and that Peter represented Jesus' view, and thought therefore that Jesus and Paul had the same view. The issue is that there are very good reasons for thinking that the account in Acts 15 is not historically accurate. We have another account of the Jerusalem Council in Galatians chapter 2, and when you compare the two accounts, they're very different. Galatians 2 is quite insistent that Paul writing this, Paul indicates that he and Peter had a knockdown, drag-out argument about the validity of the Jewish law for Gentile followers of Jesus. Paul indicates they were not on the same page on this. Acts 15 says they were on the same page of it. And I think most historians think that Paul probably knows who he's arguing with better than Luke would, who's writing 20 or 30 years later. So I think I think if Acts 15 were accurate, it probably would show that. But I think there are reasons for suspecting it's not accurate.
All right, Dr. Ehrman, we did beautiful, man. A little bit over an hour. I want to say to you, first and foremost, thank you for coming on, taking the time out. And we could probably do this again in a couple of months.
Okay. All right. Well, I've enjoyed this. Thank you very much. And thank you to your audience.
Coming out, by the way. When is your next project coming out?
The Book of Revelation. I don't know. I got to work on it. So right now I'm working on a new set of courses for the great courses on the triumph of Christianity. So.
All right.
Okay.
Ehrman.
You're welcome. All right. Thank you.